much, Jesse. Thanks to you and to Mike and everyone there at Colorado State for putting this on under incredibly challenging conditions and doing a fantastic job of running the logistics. And welcome everyone. I'm really glad to see you all. I'm here in my office at the University of Utah. So I'm maskless inside here, but if I walk out the door, I'm going to put my mask on. I'm not going to do that during the presentation. I'm going to share my screen so that you all can see what I am seeing, and I will talk you through this. And I have some notes on a couple of these slides, but I need to look down at my phone to see the notes because I'm already using a two-screen setup. So I'm going to manipulate the technology as best I can. The title of my presentation, as you see, is an American institution, quote unquote, American. WAC Geopolitics at an International Branch Campus. I will let you know ahead of time that I'm not explicitly theorizing the idea of geopolitics, but I think one of the things that is happening in my work through this project, which I'll describe in more detail in just a few minutes, is that a number of considerations that are, I think, relevant to geopolitics, and certainly just like the geopolitics of language and English language specifically, have really come to the surface. I was already sensitized to a number of those topics as a result of previous research I've done, previous teaching that I've done, but the data that I've collected and that I've analyzed, and the experience that I have with our own international branch or extended campus in Korea has really borne out a lot of those, a lot of the things I was already sensitized to seeing, and has presented, I think, some new wrinkles with respect to thinking about the relationships among students and faculty, but also their surrounds, all of the contextual stuff that surrounds and that permeates how we teach and learn and research, particularly in a transnational setting. I'm going to start with this, though. This is maybe a little bit out of left field, but I would imagine that, unless you have lived in Korea or have specific experience taking Korean language courses or something like that, you may not be able to read, per se, the characters that are on that sign, but I would bet that you can probably recognize what that is in any event. Anybody want to hazard a guess? I'm realizing now you can kind of see it in the bottom left of the screen, so don't look there. That's no fair. It is the Korean version of a sign for Starbucks coffee. Prior to, I think, only really 15 or so years ago, there were no Starbucks coffee outlets operating in South Korea. And then one of them started operating in Seoul, in a very touristy area where a lot of Americans travel to get souvenirs and things like that. Prices are a bit higher, as you might imagine. And then beyond that, the Starbucks took off, and so did a lot of other coffee establishments, many of them which were invented in Korea, so that now there are something like 17,000 coffee outlets of various brands in Seoul, which means there's a higher per capita number of coffee shops in Seoul than there is in either Seattle or San Francisco, which surprises a whole lot of Americans. Coffee culture has arrived, and the Starbucks brand obviously has arrived, as well as a lot of other things. But in this one instance, at this one Starbucks outlet in the middle of Seoul, this is, as far as I know, the only Starbucks in Korea, and maybe one of a very, very few worldwide, that actually had permission from Starbucks to create a sign that is in non-English characters. In this case, if you sound it out in Korean, it literally is a transliteration. It's Starbucks kopi is how it reads in Korean. And I always think that's a really interesting way to, it's a good hook for an audience, right? It's a way to get all of us thinking about some of the complexities of the English language in Korea, of English language teaching in Korea, the saturation of American brands that ostensibly operate in English, but also the articulation or the increasing articulation, globalization of Korean brands. K-drama, great example. K-pop, great example. I used to drive a Kia. Kia advertises all over the place, things like that. So Korea has been in this prolonged period of trying to assert itself as a global presence, not necessarily in terms of traditional hard power like military, but certainly in terms of soft power, things like consumer goods and branding and cultural artifacts, gaming, K-pop, K-drama, things like that. So the context, if you will, for English in Korea is complex. And I do research on English as an international language. I teach courses on English as an international language. And as I do that, I am reminded, and I remind my students of this passage by Henry Widdowson about, oh gosh, over 20 years or so ago now, that still rings true, and it's still something I start students with. And I'll just read the highlighted portions there. Widdowson said, when we talk about the spread of English, it is not a matter of the actual language being distributed, but of the virtual language being spread, and in the process being variously actualized. The distribution of the actual language implies adoption and conformity. The spread of virtual language implies adaptation and non-conformity. The two processes are quite different. And in fact, those two processes are very much germane in Korea, as I'll talk about in just a moment. But I wanted to talk at least for a couple of minutes about the site for my research, which, as I describe it in the book that I am finishing, with extreme thanks to Terry Myers-Zawacki, who is here in the room, who has worked closely with me as my editor, very patiently and very diligently. It will be coming out as a book, and you can read all about this. But this gives you a snapshot of what this looks like. You'll see in that map in the upper left corner, there's a circle on my campus in Salt Lake City, Utah, in the Intermountain Western portion of the United States. And then the red dot is where our University of Utah Asia campus is located, which is in New Songdo City, South Korea. This is a city that was designed from the ground up to be a so-called smart city or ubiquitous city. If you have experience in places like China or the UAE, Saudi Arabia, places like that, this is a model of building a city from the ground up that is intended to be highly centrally planned, is intended to have ubiquitous digital technology, is intended to be environmentally sustainable, all of those things. And so on the right side there, that image you see is an actual photograph of downtown New Songdo City. It looks like someone drew it and it's on the cover of a science fiction novel. It is not. That's an actual picture of what it looks like. Right now, New Songdo City, which is roughly 45 minutes by bus or by train from Seoul, has about 250,000 residents, and it was designed not only to be a ubiquitous, quote unquote, smart city, but an international city. The idea was to attract people from other countries to come, to live, to work, to research, to work in Korean concerns. Part of it was intended to be a university campus. And so as a result of a partnership between the Korean Ministry of Education, the Incheon Global Campus Foundation, and a couple of other private companies and public concerns in Korea, along with several universities, the Incheon Global Campus was created officially about 15 years ago. And what you see in the bottom left there is part of the campus. We share that campus. The University of Utah does now with about 4 other universities, including George Mason has a presence there. The State University of New York has a couple of campuses that operate there. Ghent University from Belgium operates there. There are a couple of others that might be coming in, but it is a shared campus environment. And the way our university works with it is students enroll there for the first 3 years of their undergraduate degrees at the University of Utah, and then they come to the Salt Lake City campus to complete those degrees through capstone courses. The big majors so far, and the campus has been operating since 2014. I was one of the first faculty members there in 14 and 15. The big majors are communication and psychology. There is a growing major in civil and environmental engineering, another one in film and media arts, and another one in urban ecologies. There are a couple of graduate degrees, one in particular in public health as well. If you're interested in seeing more about it, you can go to Asia Campus, all one word, .utah.edu. I said I taught there. I was there for the first year of its operation. And while I was there, I was teaching, but also doing some kind of quasi-administrative activities because it was a startup and it was all hands on deck. And that's the way we had to run it. So one of the things that I hatched while I was there was a research project. And what you see here on the screen are the research questions that I was interested in. You know, as a person who is a scholar of writing, second language writing in particular, and international education, I was interested in seeing how this thing would work. You know, how it could be that students would negotiate their way in writing through their curricula, not only in an international setting outside the United States, but in a transnational setting, and how things might change as they moved from one campus of this transnational institution to another. You can read them there, but the one that I really want to focus on actually is in bold, and it's the bottom of that list, and it's the last research question I came up with. Namely, How does writing as a privileged literate activity reveal the relationship between internationalist claims about education, a lot of which probably many of us are familiar with, and university mission statements and advertising and things like that, between those claims about education and the daily lived complexity behind such claims? One of the things I go into considerable detail about in the book is my own experience there, my own personal experience. It's a narrative that I wrote that is the bulk of one of the chapters. That goes into some of those daily lived complexities as I experienced them, and then as I observed them. And so this is a project that, among other things, has been challenging to research and write because of my own personal situation, my own personal investment, and because of a lot of the complexities of working in this kind of an environment. I want to say, owing to that challenge, I had some help from some incredibly talented former graduate students and one undergraduate student of mine, Justin Grant Whitney, who is a faculty member at Tennessee State, Teresa Chi, who is a faculty member at Queensborough Community College and is actually the Two-Year College Association program chair. If you're interested in going to the TICA conference, she's chairing that this year. And Joanne Castillo, who is an undergraduate student who came from the University of Utah. They went with me on successive trips to the Asia campus in spring of 2016, 17, and 18. And I am deeply grateful to them for their interest and their work. So this is a snapshot of some of what you get if you look at information about how English circulates in South Korea. And what I will say, just kind of as a gloss to these images, is according to some pretty authoritative estimates, about half of all money spent on education in Korea in the year 2006 went to English language preparation. By about 2009, that figure had grown to about $19 billion. And it keeps growing. I don't know what the more current numbers are, but suffice to say that it is a huge investment, and not only a public investment, but a private investment. That is to say, parents are highly motivated to spend a whole lot of money on English language education, whether the school systems are enforcing, English learning as a compulsory subject or not. In addition, about 40,000, at least according to a recent estimate, Korean parents, and that is mostly mothers, lived abroad in the United States in about 2008, 2009. You may have heard the term wild geese parents. That's what they're referring to, is one half of a Korean nuclear family parenting unit will travel to usually the west coast of the United States, maybe to Canada, and will take their child with them, enroll the child in secondary school, so that child has a leg up in terms of English education. Interestingly, one of the more promising recruiting targets for this campus in Korea is Los Angeles. So that tells you about how that kind of motion happens. I want to focus in the time that I have left on David. He is one of the students I recruited as a student participant. He attended the University Asia campus and the U of Utah from 2015 to 19. He was born and raised in Korea. He is a US citizen by virtue of his father's citizenship. He attended an international school in Korea, which was conducted in Korean and English, with a pretty heavy emphasis on English. He had never entered the United States, however, prior to coming to campus here in Salt Lake City. He majored in psychology, and he's an interesting person. Among other things, he related to me several times that one of his hobbies when he was growing up in middle school was reading articles about psychology, which is, of course, an extremely common middle school hobby for a lot of kids to have. And David decided he was going to do that as well. So David, in some ways, is very unusual, but the complexity of his experience is actually quite common among students and even faculty members at this campus. What I want to do here, and these are very wordy slides, but I won't read the whole thing, don't worry about that, is just hit some of the highlights here. This is an excerpt from an interview that I conducted with David in 2016, which was the beginning of his, or about halfway through his second year at the university. And I had asked him, because we were talking about writing, and we were talking about the ways in which he encountered writing assignments, the responses that he had, what he did, how he interacted with peers. There was kind of a set list of questions I was asking. So these are semi-structured interviews. And David, at one point I asked, okay, in response to something he had said, how did you get the job of being the one who, it seems like you're putting stuff together in like group assignments, but you're also taking a lot of the lead on writing the document, even though it's a group assignment. How did that happen, do you think? Did you volunteer? Were you elected? And David said, semi-forced, I would say. I don't know if you've seen the other students' paper, but to be honest, they aren't really good at grammar and stuff like that. So somehow I tend to be the better one. So students tend to rely on me grammar-wise and punctuations and just fixing and stuff like that, as well as to write. One of the things that's interesting about reading, David's writing, which I've done as well, and I'll look at a piece in just a second, is that it's not as if David is writing in a way that is textbook correct in English all the time. There are places where he himself will drop articles and things like that. So he is not anything like a model, English speaker, or the kind of traditional model of approaching native English speaker proficiency that still kind of exists in a number of fields like rhetoric and composition sometimes, to be honest. But in his mind, comparatively speaking, he was better able to do this than a lot of his peers. And pretty early in his career at this campus, as he relates it and as others related it, and as I noticed with other students as well, at least anecdotally, there were students who were competent enough and performed that competence well enough that other students tended to gravitate toward them in ways that are similar to, Xia Yo, and I have the reference in my book. A number of other people did some work at a Chinese campus and noticed some similar trends, that students would, in effect, like present themselves as competent, and students would go to them and they would have various reactions to that. On one hand, there were times when David was talking about that as, yeah, this is something I'm kind of proud of, and not necessarily arrogant, but certainly self-aware of that. But on the other hand, there were times when it would be annoying, and you can kind of see what David is expressing here. In this next piece, this is actually a piece of writing. What you see here and what I'm trying to show, what I noticed, is that even in this piece of writing, which he identified for me as the very first writing assignment he did as a student at this campus, this was in an introductory writing course. He is, and his instructor backed this up in some of the comments his instructor made on his writing, he is showing a level of comfort, again, not necessarily textbook perfect grammar and style all the time, but he's definitely showing a level of comfort with the genre that his instructor asked for. And in this case, it was pretty close narrative description of an educational experience, specifically involving literacy. So David wrote in this kind of literacy narrative, there stood a tall, white old man. When I said white, I meant white, including his hair and beard, wearing like a Southern country man. And I think he means hat. I'm not sure there. His blue jean and checkered shirt well fitted him along his belt with a buffalo mark graved in. He took a book out and told me to sit next to him. The couch was red, as if I am supposed to sit on a devil's chair. What David is relating there is having a volunteer reading consultant or reading tutor come into his international school when he was very young and sit down and read with him. And that may in and of itself, at the time, have been an activity that promotes some anxiety for a young version of David. But at this stage, David is reflecting back and, meeting the task of writing a literacy narrative. And in a sense, if you kind of even want to be cynical about it, doing what a number of other international students who were reported in the literature have done over the years, understanding very keenly what their teachers are looking for in something like a literacy narrative and actually giving them what they want. So whatever reading, you might apply, it does seem as if David is expressing a certain level of comfort with what he is being asked to do there. And again, that level of comfort would have been something that would have communicated to his peers. Not only did it communicate to his peers, but David suspects that his identity and the identities of other students were things that were relevant to instructors. And here he's remarking about that. And again, I'll only read the highlighted portion or the bolded portion. If we write the same paper on the same topic, and I'm an American, and the other student is a Korean, feels like the professor gives a slight advantage to the Korean students over the foreign students. I provide feedback. He's talking about his peers. I provide feedback. I proofread their papers and all that stuff. And I'm not a professional, but I can say I'm quite better than the other students here. So again, David is technically a US citizen. He's got a US passport. He had never set foot in the United States, but from his telling, he believes that he is, in a sense, being cast by some of his faculty members as an American student in comparison to some of the Korean students, even though David is phenotypically Korean, can speak Korean, but in a lot of ways seems more comfortable speaking English. So there is a lot of complexity that David directly encounters in his own identity, and also a lot of complexity that he kind of overlays as his own lens for looking at these interactions he has with peers and with instructors. I think this is okay. A couple more real quick. Yeah, we're good. He is. This is after his transition to the American campus. And I know this from other data that I collected from instructors at the Asia campus as well, that there was definitely an intent, at least among certain instructors, to make sure that students were, if anything, over-prepared to encounter the expectations that they would meet when they got to the US campus and when they were taking these, ostensibly capstone courses in their majors. And David was well aware of that. But he relates this, again, after he transitioned to this new campus. I expected them, the professors here, to be, the main campus professors would be much harder in their gradings, much more professional for some reason, that I wasn't ready for this. And I asked, how do you mean professional? And he said, well, the main campus professors were more calm and easygoing, whereas Asian campus professors, they're really strict, they're on the appointment, they follow the rules, they really have to, stuff like that. That was kind of interesting. So what David is gesturing to, I think, here and in some other comments, is definitely a different perception or a different level of importance, I guess you could say, attached to particular performances of professionalization, especially in a predominantly English language setting in a foreign country. Keep in mind that his faculty members at the Asia campus are a mix of Korean nationals and also US-based nationals who have traveled there. And so in other data that I collected from instructors, I think you can see, some back and forth, some complexities in their own relationships, dealing with English as a lingua franca on campus and the ways that impacts their relationships with their students. This last thing, this is a piece of writing that David did, I think it was in 2018, in a cross-cultural psychology class, which seems like it would be a good class to teach at a campus like this. David wrote very explicitly about a lot of the things I was just talking about. I have two cultural perspectives well mixed up. When we have done an activity in class about different views toward different images, some images I have Korean perspective and other American perspective, which, given David's history and given his encounters at both these campuses, is actually pretty understandable. But I think that is, from David's own writing, very explicitly a mention of this kind of complexity that, a lot of people in literature in the fields have noted. But I think that in the case of someone like David at a transnational campus like this, where there is always signaling to students that, hey, you're at this campus, you're going to be going to this campus, you're unusual here in Korea on this campus, you're going to be even more unusual at the US campus, really brings a lot of those complexities into sharp relief. And I'll leave you with these images. This one in the top left is a shot of downtown Seoul, which is a massive city. Bottom right is a slot canyon in southern Utah. And then you see the food truck here in Salt Lake City, the Angry Korean, and then you see the Starbucks again. All of that to suggest visually that, yes, in fact, no surprise to any of us in the room, there's a lot of complexity around these language issues at a transnational campus. And again, they're kind of highlighted in the kind of situation I studied. So that's what I've got for now. I would look forward to talking more about this. Thank you so much for your attention. Elisa, it's all yours.
Is it all mine? I love the images. I wish I had known you would show these funky images, so I'll be more prepared to send my audience as well.
Just send some from Armenia afterward.
Yes. All right. So I'm going to make some connections, although it's very hard to follow your talk because obviously you're close to finishing your book. You even have an editor that has read through your manuscript. And I am still in the baby steps here of creating or working towards the creation of a writing program. So just quickly to delineate some of the similarities and some of the differences. What you mentioned about, I wanted to underline this because I didn't plan on to talk much about it, but it's very important. English is also lingua franca on our campus, although the majority of the student body and faculty do not speak English as their native language. Language also is very, I'm going to quickly share with you. I tried to find a Starbucks sign in Armenian, but you are right. The Starbucks are not going to allow just anyone to have their sign butchered, so to speak. But unfortunately, or unfortunately for the capitalistic world, Armenians have managed to sneak into all other brands, so they do have their own signage in that language, and that is very important to my presentation too. So I'm going to quickly show you how Armenian looks like, because wait, this is not it here. I don't know how many of you have ever seen Armenian written. Has anybody? Please raise your hand if you can read Armenian or have even seen Armenian.
Is it similar to Georgian?
It is not similar to Georgian.
Okay.
It is a unique language that sits on its own in its branch of the Indo-European tree of languages. That is not related to, as allegedly some say, to Greek or Latin. So as you can see, all I can show you that can be a reminder is in the upper right corner up here. You can see the Tokyo Olympic Games, so you can see how Tokyo is spelled in Armenian. So it is rather from my perspective, and a non-Armenian speaker and learner of Armenian, beginner, it is very difficult. Actually, it is very squiggly, not to use that word in a negative way. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about. Oh, I see there's something going on in the chat. You have seen it, Amanda, but you can't read it. Yes, it's very difficult actually to read, or at least I say so that I can excuse my inability to be a good reader and fluent. Yeah, I would like to also apologize to you because I'm not going to be able to use this full screen with my presentation because my laptop somehow doesn't like that and it shuts down. Is that okay with you? Okay, thank you. As you can see, I don't have too many slides and I don't have too much information because, again, these first steps after listening to Jay should have been called baby steps. But I would like to tell you a bit about our university, about the country where it is located, our student body, and I would like to provide some theoretical considerations that I have reviewed for the development of a WAC program on our campus. And it's not going to be a transnational program because we do not have an affiliation. We do have an affiliation with a Western university. We are affiliated with the University of California system. However, we do not have yet a partner to create a transnational program. So everything would be from scratch in this WAC initiative. So this is the building in which I'm sitting right now. This is the building that I referred to when I was talking to you about the COMI hall in which I'm residing right now, virtually at least. So this is the main building of our university, which was given by the government in 1991 when the university was established. And it was the building that was part of where the Armenian Communist Committee was meeting. So this is very important because I would like to give you some context, which is, I argue, the most important part in the development of a writing program or a WAC program to begin with. So the American University of Armenia is situated in Yerevan, which is the capital of Armenia. It's not nearly as big as Seoul. It's only 1.5 million people. It has been alive for 30 years. It was established the day after Armenia gained independence from the Soviets, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It is US accredited, and actually it is the only US accredited institution of higher education on the territory of the ex-Soviet Union, which is an interesting fact. And then it's fairly small. We have about 2,000 students, 250 faculty members. The most important part is that we predominantly have a student body who are native Armenian speakers. We do have some exchange students from Europe. We do have some students who come from the surrounding countries, certainly not Turkey and Azerbaijan, but some other countries that contribute to the diversity of the linguistic diversity at our school. With that in mind, we do have to worry a lot about writing. And I, as someone who has specialized in rhetoric, I really would like to create a writing program or some sort of a WAC program to begin with again at that university, because I think that it is really needed. As the small institution that we are, our English department is fairly small as well. So I have to be very flexible and versatile in my teachings. I often teach literature classes, for which I don't complain. However, I would like us to develop more writing classes that can help these students develop their rhetorical skills in English. A bit more about it. You guys can interrupt me at any time or ask me any questions. I was hoping that it would be more of a, and I'm hoping it would be more of a conversational format because, again, I don't have so much research data to present to you. It's more of a presentation on what I'm trying to achieve with a few colleagues actually on campus. I should give them credit and I'll tell you about them shortly. And at that point, there's lots of questions. So I would truly appreciate your input and your suggestions at any point. So a bit about the cultural and the political context, which I argue needs to be considered. And we could hear from Jay's presentation that, yes, indeed, that's very logical. However, in the research that I have been acquainted with, not everybody really considers so much the cultural and political context, and mostly because for the most part, people who talk about WAC or transnational WAC, they talk about institutions that are again either US based or have some, they're not in the US, but they have some affiliation with US institutions. Therefore, they transfer or transport or translate a model that has been practiced in the US. However, I do believe that, and especially after I've only been in Armenia for a couple of years now. After I've spent a couple of years, very hard years, some may note, working there, I can attest to the fact that really the context matters so much. So quickly about the linguistic situation in Armenia, the Soviets did leave the heritage of Russian. So most Armenians speak Russian in addition to Armenian. Therefore, actually, I'm not Armenian. I'm a native speaker of Bulgarian, which is another Slavic language, which does not make it necessarily easier to speak Russian, but it is closer to me and to my native language than it is Armenian. There is also a phenomenon that has been going on in the last several years, especially with some war-ridden places nearby that have great diasporic populations of Armenians, and namely Syria and Lebanon. So a lot of Armenians from Syria and Lebanon have repatriated, and they have brought their languages and some of the greatest diversity, which I really see within the local communities, re-emergence of Western Armenia, but also we have to know that Farsi, Arabic, and French have been added to the coup. So, for example, I have two kids of the age of 10 and 12, and when they go to school, most of their friends speak at least three or four languages already, which is quite interesting, and does contribute to something that I will talk shortly about, some sort of a multicultural or pluricultural, I don't know, environment to begin with. Do you guys have any questions? Because how many of you, has anybody been to Armenia?
No, but I'll just say really quickly, I mean, I mentioned that I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Poland in the late 90s, and that was during a period when there were a lot of people who had been taught Russian as a compulsory school subject. But when we would ask them, there would still, we lived in northeastern Poland, there were still a lot of signs that were in Russian. And we would ask our friends, like, hey, that sign right there, can you read that sign for me? And they would say, oh, no, I can't read it. Even though they had taken 12 years of Russian. And so it was likely that they could read it, but there were just reasons why they didn't want to claim, competence in Russian. I'm wondering if that is the case in Armenia, like what the reception of Russian is like.
That is a great question. Not so much in Armenia as much as in Georgia, which is very interesting because Georgian politics since Saakashvili in the last 12 years or so has been very pro-Western, and the young generation there that really rejects to learn Russian, not only read, but even conduct basic communication. And funny enough, a lot of their tourists in Georgia come from Russia because they border Russia directly, and they speak with them in English, or try to at least. So in Armenia, that's not quite the case. Most people do speak Russian. You can get by quite well with it. They do not reject that heritage outright, but the younger generation, increasingly so, is more interested in English and other Western languages rather than learning and communicating in Russian, or sometimes they're proficiency is not very good, which confuses me. Yeah, that is a great question, and it also relates to what I was going to say on this slide, and that is because of the geopolitical situation of Armenia, it is pretty much sandwiched between Muslim countries. I know Turkey, Azerbaijan, and to the south we have Iran, and then to the north Georgia, which has not been very friendly recently. And Armenia claims to be the first country that has adopted Christianity in 301. As a state religion. So imagine this situation of, first of all, religious diversity, and Armenia being the sole representative for, again, with Georgia, but Georgia is not very friendly these days. So it has been really interesting in their relationship with Russia, to go back to what you asked, Jay. And especially in the recent year, because last year, okay, so they've had a pro-Russian government since the fall of the Soviets, and that has been very convenient for Armenia because it had provided protection in this very difficult politically part of the world, buffer zone for Russia. However, 3 years ago, they had a revolution, and in that revolution, they elected their first democratic government, which was looking westwards. It still is. But that created a big problem, because I'm sure that most of you knew, however, during the pandemic, perhaps most people are more interested in their own pandemic case scenarios and how they had to navigate that world. But Armenia, on the top of the pandemic, we had a war last year. In which war is this? Oh yeah. Can you guys see my slides? Even though they're in a limited screen space, but yeah, so Azerbaijan attacked, I'm sure you're acquainted with that, attacked the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is predominantly populated by Armenians, and Armenia had to respond so to defend itself, and it's part of this war, which was not easy to end, and when the war ended, we lost 5,000 young lives, because most of the soldiers were drafted or volunteers from the pool of my first year students. So it was a really hard semester last fall, and I learned a lot about how the local context, and this is where I'm going to go next, because it really matters in terms of talking to people about rhetorical skills, or being able to negotiate a context even in which you can teach them how to communicate on paper, not only using US academic standards. So it was truly an amazing learning experience for me, as horrible as it sounds, the war period. And so I'll give you an example and then proceed with my next slide, which is a bit more theoretical. When the war started at the end of September last year, I was teaching a class called Research Methods, which was to prepare our capstone writers for the following semester. And they were interested in all kinds of interesting topics related to English and writing to rhetoric. And suddenly, more than 50% of my students decided that they really wanted to write about the war and how it has affected them as their politics. They wrote about rhetoric of their politicians. They wrote about history. They wrote about history and how unjust their own, lot in life is. So context really matters for these people. I don't think that I could possibly consider any developing a class or let alone a program that would consider implementing a Western model of thought or theory. Real quick, this is a very quick line of, slide on how what we lack, what we don't have in relation to this, to a structure, I guess, is for the most part. But there isn't an immersive English language experience, even though English is a lingua franca at our university. We do not have that. We don't have any living and learning communities, which I do believe create the culture and or cultural context in which one could, through curricular programs, develop, U.S. stand or academic standard or academic writing proficiency. We do have very limited writing courses in the disciplines, if any at all. We do have some, but not that many, and we do not have ready writing classes, and we have a lot of graduate programs. And I did something with them, and obviously I scratched on the top of my slide. I don't know if you can see that. It's not intentional. All right. This is my dog looking down on the downtown Armenia during the pandemic. It looked like we were the only people and dogs survivors in the country. All right, so do you guys have questions before I jump into what I want to talk to you about here? Oh, there's something in the chat. Oh. Yeah. Morgan was in Turkey for 5 years teaching. Yeah. And yeah, it's very hard to have friends in the urban state if you live in Turkey. But I hope that in the future these relationships are going to be improved somehow. Yeah, we all have negative, linguistic imperialism. We all grew up, because I did grow up in Bulgaria when Russian was mandatory, and that's why my Russian today is not as good as it should be. But there is always negative sentiments on the imposed language, and this is what worries most of the scholars who develop translingual writing approach to teach about the whole linguistic imperial story. It works like that in Russia too. How constrained students might be in wanting to write about the war and Armenians' relations with neighbor countries. They are very constrained, and at the same time, they are, they somehow, I don't know, my students are self-righteous in some way, which is very interesting, and I find it very, I was going to say cute, but that's not the right word. It's interesting. So I'm always on their journey to find ways in which we can learn more in order to be a little bit more self-critical and less arrogant. So they are self-righteous when they write about the war in so many ways. I learned the hard way that it is pretty much impossible to converse with them, especially during the war and after the war, using some Western perspective or neutral perspective. It was impossible. And again, that was an interesting rhetorical exercise in which I think I learned more than they did. Unfortunately, I failed them there. How the consortium for graduate communication, I do not know that, Siri. Thank you. I will look it up. Is this chat preserved somehow? Can I look it up later? Oh, I just saved it. So what is the consortium for graduate communication? Or I guess I can look it up later.
I will put the URL for you.
Okay.
And I think, I'm going to have a question for Jay also. So I'm just real interested in the rest of your slides.
Okay, how much time do I have? Do you have 3 more minutes at least?
Yeah, we have about 15 minutes total left. So,
okay, so
yeah.
I'll be pretty quick so we can, field questions.
Great.
All right, so in terms of different models that can work, I, for years, have been a bit of an advocate for Paul Matsuda's approach because maybe I am myself a second language writing person. But then the translinguistic theoretical model was also very interesting with some obvious flaws that I'm as a speaker of several languages, I find these ideas a bit old, actually. But we can go into more detailed discussion with you because I love talking about that, and maybe we can have a nicer conversation at the end. There is an important consideration and observation that some folks made when a very important book called Transnational Writing Across the Curriculum Programs, I think it's called. I have it in the resources below. You will see that came out, and they some in one article they were saying they're comparing this transnational program, which was in one part in Pittsburgh, I think University of Pittsburgh, the other one in Doha, and they were saying, you know what, this does not simply work if we're just going to consider it without the proper context. And this sounds also logical, so I have been talking about a lot, but I wanted to mention the scholars as well to say that yes, a lot of people have noticed that. And ultimately, I really like the proposition by a scholar called Hempaldo, who in that same volume advocated for a focus on the difference and negotiation across language, and not so much looking at the micro level, which would be the multilingual or plurilingual approach and the translinguistic code meshing and all that as well, but to emphasize the languages and practice in a specific spatial temporal context. And here he's referring to a proposed notion by Pennycook in 2010. I think he wrote that we should pay attention to the spatial political, mesopolitical space, which of practice, which is between the local and the global. And this is where I'm going with all that, because I believe that we cannot go towards the global, which would be going towards the US academic writing and the US context of teaching, which we teach writing in the US, which I have experience of for actually several years, many years. But we should go from the local, because it is so much more important that we meet our students where we are. This is, I'm not going to end up on this on this cliche, but it always reminds me of the romantic turn in translation, where we bring the translator brings always the author towards the writer, more so than the writer has to go towards the reader. All right, and the few baby steps that I have made so far. Last year, when we were not in the pandemic, it was a lot easier to do workshops, but I did workshops also on Zoom for faculty, and trying to introduce different ways in which they can incorporate writing assignments into their syllabi, using social annotation tools and whatnot, and then trying to appeal to them to consider the local context, but not in a negative way, because some of that can happen too. I did collaborate with some librarians to present at it's a consortium, this one conference, Amical, if you've heard of it. It's all the universities that are outside in Europe and in Central and Western Asia, American universities. So we did different things there. It was really interesting. And finally, we did an assessment, which was our first assessment of our writing of our students in the English department. So that's from me, not as detailed, but I guess I have a few years before I get to the point where Jay is to write my book on it. Yeah. I do have some sources if you're interested. I'll be happy to share this slides in case. Okay, here we have a. Okay, I am stopping the sharing of my screen, right?
Elisa?
Yes.
Can we see your last slide, the sources?
Sure. Can you see it?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I have the book, Transnational Writing Program Administration, so I'll take a look at those too.
I don't have I have only electronic copies of some of it. So, I mean, yeah, see, It's very hard to get some field-specific books or minions, so sometimes you should look it up.
You might be interested in the book WAC and Second Language Writing on the WAC Clearinghouse.
Mm-hmm.
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Terry, thanks for that question. I answered it in chat.
I see.
Yeah. Actually, I mean, David was one of the ways in which he was sort of like a lot of the other students. You know, I followed a very small number. I ended up following 4 students in my own study. But I also know just anecdotally that a lot of the other students who have been in this, who started over there and have come over here, have generally done very, very well. Their GPAs are at or above the averages in their majors, and in psychology in particular, David, I think I mentioned is a psychology major. That's a very writing intensive major. That's something that I've learned about psychology. And something else that's related in the book is this particular course at the Asia campus that had become infamous because it was a really early introduction for students to research methods in psychology. But it wasn't just a methodology course. It was, I think, appropriately an extremely writing intensive course. But it was like students got out of the first year writing course sequence and then got directly into that course, which is, I think, the way it kind of should work for students who are pretty sure they're going to major in that. But it was extremely challenging. But you know, he got through it. A number of other students got through it, and by the time they were getting here, they had already, in a number of cases, reached out to faculty members who were leading labs. It's becoming increasingly common for undergraduate students to get involved in live research projects and research labs in psychology. And the Asia campus students have really been no exception to that rule. In a couple of cases, I know in one case in particular, a student came over and was actually a writing tutor for, I forget which department it was either psychology or communication, but one of the Korean nationals, one of the L1 Korean speakers, became like a writing consultant or a TA for one of these professors in one of these writing intensive courses, which enrolled over here primarily native English speaking students, which is one of those things that as a second language writing researcher you like to point to and say, hey, look at that. Okay, so Amanda asked a question about teaching English, particularly in Korea, and colonialism. It's not enough. What's the best way to honor local culture while teaching abroad? That's a huge question, and it's a really good one. And I think Amanda and I'd be happy to talk more about. No, that's okay. It's a great question. I'd be happy to talk more, just like outside of the presentation, if you wanted to email back and forth, whether it's through the app or just me here. I think this is in my presentation, but I'll give it to you. But Korea has such a complicated relationship with English that a lot of what you might, I think a lot of secondary school teachers who have gone over to Korea from the United States have noticed this. That's been a very popular thing for recent college graduates to do, sort of like the JET program in Japan. But they're attracted to Korea by a lot of things, among them, tax-free income. But when they get here, in a lot of cases, these teachers, when they get to Korea, in a lot of cases, those teachers have tried to teach, let's say, critical perspectives on English and things like that. And most of the resistance to doing that has been from the students and the parents, and then by extension, the schools. So there's actually a high degree of investment in Korea in teaching, a really specific, narrowly construed school version of English that comes directly out of US and maybe at times British textbooks. So trying to figure out how to, and I hear what you're saying. On one hand, how to negotiate some of the critical perspectives on language with the idea that in order to be employed, you need to adhere to a particular curriculum that may look very, very traditionalist as an approach to teaching English. That's a tough thing to balance. Sunday had okay. So The work ethic can be really different. That's another big question as well. I think that that's something, I mean, and Sunday, I think you know this as well from doing, work in scholarship in second language writing. Again, a lot of international students, a lot of the, let's say, resistance to the idea, for instance, of trying out translingual pedagogies or even critical language pedagogies. This may be something that Elitsa was discussing, and it may be part of your own, objection to translingualist approaches or your concern about them. Is again, a lot of the resistance that instructors encounter to critical language approaches come from the students themselves, because their perception is, as international students, they've internalized the idea that what they are there to learn is to approximate what a native speaker of English would do with English. Whether in fact that's a goal that is A, reasonable, B, important or not, we are working within a pedagogical context that for generations now has taught students that what you want to do is sound like a native English speaker. And by extension, write like one.
Yes, I agree. In a fairly homogeneous non-native speaker context, that is usually what happens. But I'm afraid that the translingual model really capitalizes more on the diversity and the embracing of the diversity when it stresses upon the individual choices. So if we're to actually talk with linguistics here, it's more about the idiolect and promoting the idiolect in that very typical American individualistic sense. But we are working with cultures often that are not coming from the home. I mean, I work with students who don't have that, and you have to first teach them what individualism is, to ask them to embrace this concept. In that article by Hempel, there's an excellent example of a scholar, I think, not a scholar, a writer, and I don't know what her origin is. She tries to incorporate code meshing in order to perform her identity, so to speak, linguistic identity. But then she acknowledges that there's always going to be, she can't do it because there's always a structural and political hegemony that she's experiencing. When she does that, she gets engaged in the it's a catch. It's not possible sometimes. I just think that it's very theoretically beautiful and appeals to some ideas across different fields that I don't know. I know that you're writing a book on translingualism, Jay, so I should shut up here.
No, I'm not writing a book on translingualism. I've published a bit on translingualism, but I have. We could have a much longer conversation about it and about some of the concerns I think you're rightly raising about it. That I have a great deal of affinity for translingualist approaches because of some of the critical questions about language that are asked. At the same time, I think that it can be easy to gloss over some of the different attitudes about language and some of the investments people have in language. Like some of the most strident critiques about translingualist approaches, at least in the United States, have come from folks who come from a tradition of studying African-American vernacular English, for instance, that, that takes a perspective on language that really treats language as if it is something that it's there and it's got social stakes and it's got political stakes. So a translingualist argument might be likely to fall on deaf ears, at least initially, if they're saying, well, the differences among languages may not matter very much, Anyway, we can talk a lot more about that later.
And obviously it is time to wrap up. I am really curious about Terry's question though, so I'm just going to throw that in there to Elsa real quick. I don't know if you can see that in the chat, Elsa. She's asking how you became acquainted with WAC. This whole presentation has been fascinating to me, and I feel like that would be a good question to wrap up with. So maybe like 2 minutes. We'll just go over time for like 2 or 3 minutes if you want to answer that one.
Sorry, who was asking me that? I didn't see it.
It's the second one from the bottom of the chat. And
okay.
it's,
How did you become acquainted with that? Oh, okay. So I actually did my PhD at Washington State University, where I was very proud to say that our writing program was always ranking in the top 10 or 11 sometimes in the last many years. And I was running a graduate writing center there, and I worked with a lot of international students, and I really loved it because usually the second ones. So I got acquainted with WAC because we didn't have a WAC initiative there through there. I'm interested interested in developing a writing program, but I hear that the first step, and I'm very, very much of a newbie, so in terms of the administrative part of it. So I thought that that would be a great idea to start some WAC initiative, which is what I was calling it. But there's a lot of political issues associated with that at a small institution, so I won't go there. Does that? I do need a lot of know-how, I know.
And then she asked if you work with Bill Condon.
I did work with Bill Condon. How do you know Bill Condon? He was working for me.
Oh, Bill's a long time WAC person.
Yeah, he's wonderful. He recently wanted to come to Armenia, but I think he asked me this question during the war and I told him not to.
Okay, guys, I'm going to wrap it up, but thank you so much. This was great. Both presentations were wonderful and the question and answer session was so great. You guys did a really good job with all of that. So it's nice to meet you all, and I will see you probably throughout the week.
Thank you all so much for being here, for your time, for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'll get back to you. I have one more question. I'll get back to you, Alexander. I saw your question.